I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with one of our contributors, Ben Koltun, who is Director of Research at Beacon Policy Advisors. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Diane.
Thanks for joining us. I'm loving your article that you wrote here. House Speaker race portends chaotic times for governing and markets. You said it. As of this taping, I think for Kevin McCarthy, we're going into round 12. What's going on? Who's to blame here?
Oh, well, before laying the fault, it may be worth laying the foundation of why are we having a House Speaker race go as long as it has since before the Civil War. But this isn't something that's necessarily new. Just last Congress, we had the Democrats going through a pretty chaotic spell where they had the longest budget reconciliation process in history. It took well over a year. So there's something going on here in Congress, and I think it's worth maybe pinning down some of the foundational points here. And that's because I think there's an inherent instability in Congress. When you look at kind of Congress in the last century, between 1955 and 1995, control of the House did not change once. It was Democrats who hold control, and their majority was over 50 seats in every year at the least. But since that time, the House has flipped 5 or 4 times, and Republicans, they only hold a 4-seat majority, which is the same as Democrats. They only have 4 seats to spare. So what does that mean? Now you think like a smaller majority means that there's a greater likelihood in working together across the aisle, working with Democrats or Republicans in a bipartisan way, but that's not the case. There's historic polarization in our politics. So what this means is that leadership has a smaller margin of error for delivering votes. And that means that there's more leverage. You can't lose more than 2% of your caucus. Now, in this day and age, it's pretty easy to bring along 90% of the caucus. And that's what you see Kevin McCarthy do. He has brought along 90% of his Republican counterparts to vote for him for Speaker. But he needs getting that final 8% is the problem. And getting that final 8% is you have to deal with a lot of these idiosyncratic members. And so that's basically like herding cats.
Well, when you say idiosyncratic members, I just want to step back a second, and whether you call it the rogue contingent, these 20 GOP members that are holding up things, wouldn't they say democracy is messy? Is that not really what we're seeing here, or is it something different at play? Because we're presenting it as a problem.
Democracy is messy, but I think for some of these members, the messiness is not a means to an end, but an end unto itself. And so what do I mean by this? Is that, today there's a historic distrust in institutions of power. Congress has a 7% approval rating. It's one of the least well trusted institutions of power, and these Republicans are really tapping into that. They really don't like. It's not about disliking Democrats or Republicans, it's disliking this institution. And so what they see in Kevin McCarthy, they see someone who operates with flattery, not authority. McCarthy, he's been running for Speaker for 8 years since his last failed effort in 2015. That he kind of says what he wants to say to kind of get the votes. He's raises over a $500 million for candidates, and he crisscrosses across the country to campaign for people. And that's just anathema to some of these Republican holdouts. They want to upend, or rather even just end, just the way how government is run and functions. And so they see McCarthy as someone who is kind of a bygone era, or kind of represents the worst of kind of the institutions of power. And so what they're asking for is a complete change. And even that may not be enough for some of them who call themselves never Kevins, that they just want to see a fresh face in leadership. And so when you're operating with small margins and you're operating historic polarization where Democrats aren't willing to give any votes for McCarthy, you're kind of in between a rock and a hard place. And these holdouts know they have this leverage, and they're wielding it as much as they can.
I'm conscious of the fact that we're having this conversation on the second anniversary of the January 6th riots. Attacks. I don't even know what to describe them at this point. But one thing that's been interesting in this I would call it a debacle so far, is the fact that the former president, Donald Trump, does not seem to have much sway over this contingent that allegedly pledges allegiance to him.
Yes, I think an important thing to know is that Trump didn't start this movement. He he created a marketing for it. He called it "Make America Great Again." But before that, it was the Tea Party movement. And so he doesn't hold direct sway over kind of this discontent of kind of the establishment institutions. He's just kind of, he wants to like leave his mark on it. But it's clear that now that he's out of power, now that he still doesn't have Twitter, it's harder for him to be kind of involved in the news cycle, where a lot of these members are kind of eager to be atop of the news cycle. His say does not hold much sway. And I think it's also important to note that for Trump, a lot of this is about him. He's not saying do this for me. He's saying, well, you should vote for McCarthy because he's a good choice. And so I think there's a difference between this being a rebuttal directly of Trump versus this being a rebuttal of McCarthy and the establishment. And they're just saying, no, Trump, we support Trump, as you saw Matt Gaetz nominating Donald Trump as Speaker of the House. But it's more just it's not Trump's bailiwick of where he can like kind of leave his influence. But it is also a reminder that Trump is at his weakest point since he's entered politics in 2015. It's been 2 years since the insurrection. He was voted out of office. His arch rival Mitch McConnell was reelected as the longest Senate leader in history. And there's someone who's really eyeing to out Trump in Florida, in Governor Ron DeSantis. And so I think that this is kind of does underscore some of the lower power that Trump holds these days.
No, we're talking about dysfunction, and so let's before, we're not prognosticators here. Obviously, there's going to be some end to this, and somehow, but the GOP itself, this level of divisiveness. I don't know if you want to speak to that, because I think there's certainly going to be a lot of examination after this episode, even if they do come to some sort of understanding. What do you think? Tell us a little bit about the evolution that you're seeing. Is this party of 20 likely to grow bigger? Is it now likely to be more marginalized? We're certainly seeing the former president not seen as strong as contender, perhaps, as he was a couple of months ago.
Well, certainly this wing of the Republican Party is here to stay. I think with McCarthy, whether he wins or whether he doesn't win the role for Speaker, one thing was clear was that after 2015, when he lost because he was not seen as conservative enough, he made a conscious decision to ingratiate himself with the conservative, or call it the Tea Party, or the MAGA elements of the party. And so even if Trump is not the leader, even if McCarthy is not the leader of Republicans in the House, Trumpism in parlance is here to stay. It's just, what's the next iteration of Trumpism? Is it these people like Matt Gaetz? Is it these people like Chip Roy who are looking to kind of wield the power of the House and the House rules and the kind of the organization to try to create drastic cuts in spending, to try to hold shutdowns over kind of border wall policies, and trying to maybe negotiate a change in entitlement spending at the risk of the first ever default of U.S. debt. And then at the same time, at the presidential level, it may be Trump. I mean, he's running for office, but his biggest competitor is not someone who's anti-Trump. It's someone who is even more Trumpy, and that's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And so it's not an either or of whether we're going to have Trumpism or this MAGA element or not. It's just what's the variant going to look like. And someone like DeSantis is, as you can see, that he had his inauguration this week after having a big reelection in November. And his focus is on attacking kind of businesses, this so-called wokeism, ESG investing, and this anti-institutionalist, anti-experts, that you're kind of seeing some of these similar elements in the Republican holdouts. And just not to mention that Ron DeSantis was an original founder of the House Freedom Caucus, which is where all these holdouts belong to in the House. You're talking about institutions.
Let's pivot from Congress for a second, because we're seeing some workarounds in a way with some other institutions in Washington that if they certainly can't make policy, but we're getting edicts, FTC and otherwise. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so nature abhors a vacuum. And so what could happen, ironically, is a gravitation away from kind of House Republicans and more towards steady institutions of power. So as you're saying, the FTC had a rollout on non-compete agreements, which is a major shift in labor and competition policy. President Biden, despite being 80 years old, he's very likely going to run for re-election. And he wants to contrast himself a chaotic legislative branch with a robust regulatory agenda. And so you're going to see a continuing focus towards power being directed in the executive branch if things can't get done in the legislative branch. So there's the Federal Trade Commission. They're looking to also release a pretty comprehensive data privacy policy. The Securities and Exchange Commission, they're looking in April to release climate disclosure requirements for corporations. And then there's the greater geopolitical dynamic of the United States versus China in this kind of stiff competition policy. While there may be desire in Congress to do some action at the legislative level, if they can't get something done, the administration will go forward. And so we're already seeing a possibility of executive orders on outbound investment restrictions into investments in China, further restrictions on things like semiconductors, and perhaps even a continuing trade war with some tariffs there. And so if nothing gets done in the House, that doesn't mean nothing gets done in Washington, D.C. It's kind of the opposite. It's just power shifts to an area where things can get done.
Which is ironic in a way, because then the whole area of deep state, et cetera, where the power lies, it could give more fodder to this wing. Let's talk about the here and now. Do you see a likely outcome? We're seeing concessions from Kevin McCarthy. We're hearing talk of some sort of deal potentially with the Democrats. I can't even begin to wade into the weeds, so I'm going to pivot over to you. What do you think is likely? How is this going to play out?
McCarthy and his leadership allies realize, they can't make a deal with Democrats. That's just the nature of this partisan world that we live in, and that these 212 votes are going to stick with Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader. And so the goal is, what concessions can they make with kind of the Republican holdouts, to get him to 218 votes? And so he made a deal last night with some of the holdouts. A lot of concessions on how the 118th Congress is organized, giving a lot more power to kind of the far right and less power to leadership. Now, does that provide enough votes? It won't. The goal is to provide some votes that move away from voting for someone else towards McCarthy. And then the goal is to do a squeeze play, which is just to pressure these last remaining holdouts, or enough of them, in order to kind of maybe bring concessions or other thing to pressure them into voting for McCarthy. But to paraphrase the Yogi Berra, 90% of counting votes is mental, the other half is physical. There's something of a topsy-turvy environment here, thinking that this strategy can work, especially when these holdouts feel empowered going against and being in the limelight and going against McCarthy and with their goal of like bringing him down. So McCarthy, as I said, he's been running for speaker for 8 years. He's willing to go the distance, but the rest of the Republican conference isn't willing to wait out that long. And so there's going to be a point in time, if this squeeze play doesn't work. Now, it may, but if it doesn't, there's going to be increasing pressure in the coming days among McCarthy allies to tell him to step aside and to make room for someone else to try to win the gavel. And that next person would be Representative Steve Scalise, the second-ranking Republican. Now, Scalise is seen as more authentically conservative than McCarthy, and he does have pretty broad support among kind of the conservatives to the moderates of the party. And so I think some of these never Kevin voters, the Matt Gaetz, the Lauren Boeberts, the Andy Biggs of the world, may be a little more amenable to voting for Scalise. But of course, he is still part of leadership. And if they're looking for a fresh face and someone who is not a part of the current leadership apparatus, then all bets are off of what happens next. And it's in that point where there's kind of a lot of chaos, and there may be such exasperation that you could see some sort of deal with Democrats, although that's still kind of very far away. And so I think that's why there's a lot of kind of all bets are off if neither McCarthy nor Scalise can get the votes.
Well, it would be entertaining if the stakes were not so high. So thanks for making us smarter about this, Ben. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Likewise.